So good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the OpenUK Show and Tell. We do these show and tells every couple of months, and it's a way for us to share the work that we're doing in research and reporting and to learn more about what others across the planet are doing in the open source space. We've had a lot of really interesting discussions around AI and other very poignant topics this year. The videos from those will be available on the website. So if you want to find out a bit more, you can see past sessions. You can also see what's coming up, what's coming down the line. Today, we're going to be talking about license shifts, open washing, and forking in open source. There's probably nothing more topical in the last couple of weeks, according to the tech press and open source, than these topics. So just to get us into the session, everything we do at OpenUK is subject to our code of respect and our competition or antitrust policy. So if you're not familiar with those, please make yourselves familiar. Want to share with you a few of our upcoming events. We've got a lot going on. We're just back from Labour Party conference where we did a session on AI and a session on data centres, and that data centre session will be followed up on the 9th of October in the House of Lords. We're going to be holding a round table where you can participate as an audience member, where you should have an opportunity to speak. But that data center roundtable will focus on openness and data centers and sustainability. And that will take place 2 to 3:30, 9th of October, particularly busy day for us because that evening we've also got our apprentice meetup. We've got a really successful meetup which Jen Riggins runs at Avanade. And I'm just going to share the date for that with you in a moment. But we've set up a second meetup, and this is for our apprentices. And those are folk who've been in open technology for under 10 years. And it looks like a manual, which it is not. We have one speaker at each event, and there's a good mix coming down the line of male and female speakers. It's taking place at Red Badger's offices. They're very kindly sponsored this. And this is an opportunity for us to get people together who are under 10 years in open source and to help them with their career progression, both from a technical and a practical perspective. So the next one of those is happening on the 9th of October with Alex Scammon from G Research joining us to share some of his war stories with that group. It's really a nice informal event and a great way to help people progress their careers in open source. We've got a Thought Leadership Day, more to follow on that next week. And on the 15th, we have a meetup, one of our full meetups in London, which will focus on can open source be a business? Quite relevant, actually, to what we're talking about today. Matt Barker and I have done a number of panels on this, and this time we're joined by Lee Wright and Paula Kennedy. So that should be a great evening. We also have a 7th November roundtable, which we can come back to later, but that's going to be looking at skills gap in our reporting. And we have on the 13th of December an AI and skills show and tell. So if you're interested in this event, if you enjoy it, the next one will be on the 13th of December. They're always 4 to 5:30, and they usually last somewhere between 60 and 90 minutes, depending on the questioning at the end. The format is, as we'll follow today, 25-minute presentation from 2 to 3 speakers. If you can put your questions in the chat or hold to the end of the speaker session, we'll then take 5-10 minutes to do some questions before we move on to the next speaker. And at the end, assuming there is time, we as a group can have a discussion if there's time available. So I'm going to today have 2 speakers join us. First of all, James Governor, who many of you will know, who's a co-founder at Redmonk, and he's going to talk about a recent report around license change, which I think is really fascinating. We're going to move from that license change and economic impact into Dawn Foster, who is an OpenUK board member, as well as being Director of Data Science at Chaos. And Dawn's going to talk about some work she's been doing on forking. And then I'll talk briefly about a report OpenUK is working on shaping markets, where all of this is relevant, and we'll open the discussion up to the floor. I will afterwards share a number of links, because there was a Stephen O'Grady piece on forking. I've written a couple of things this week on forking. Stephen Wally has done some blog posts on it. And then I think that I'll also share the Redmonk report and anything else that comes up in this conversation. So you'll find all of those with the video from today on Monday on our website. So with that, if it's okay, I am going to hand over, James, to you. I'm going to stop sharing to allow you to share.
Okay, good. Well, I've got some slides that I put together. Yeah, James from Redmonk, and we spend a lot of time in and around these issues. The question of licensing is an important one. I mean, we provide research and advisory services, and frankly, yeah, we've spent a fair bit of time with clients and others asking exactly this question about license changes and indeed whether that's a good idea. I think that from our perspective, you know, we've got we're pretty consistent. We don't believe that companies do need to have proprietary licenses in order to succeed. But obviously, for various reasons, companies make their own choices. So we haven't exactly always been in the room where it happens, but I think we've got some insights into why decisions are made. And anyway, let's look a little bit. I think, what's the data? Is it a good idea to change your license? I think is one of the questions that we recently examined and that Amanda asked us to talk about. So, what's a business model? I think it's a good question because, as Amanda said in her intro, is open source a business model? According to the Oxford, I mean, I'm old enough that I think it's called OED, but apparently it's now called Oxford Languages. A business model is a design for the successful operation of a business, identifying revenue sources, customer base, products, and details of financing. That's, you know, that reasonable definition, and pretty clearly, just in looking at that, that's not the same as a definition of what open source is. What is open source? Very clear, very unambiguous, at least as far as we're concerned, and people that have been in the trenches for a bit. And that would be this question of open source project for projects licensed with an OSI approved open source license. We believe that open source has a value, it has a benefit, it is a choice. And, you know, again, Amanda mentioned AI. Pretty clearly, in that world, there's, I would say, an ambiguity. They are trying to call things open source that are not. If you have a license that is not OSI approved, and it frankly says that you can use a model, but then if you start making money, Facebook will be within their rights, or Meta will be in their rights to stop you using it. That indeed is not an open source license. So open source is not the same. It is not a business model in its own right, which is not to say that open source, which is fundamentally a way of building software, cannot be applicable within a particular business model. Two things can be true. Open source is not a business model, and yet it can enable business models. You know, I've been in this business for a long time, and we have worked with scores, hundreds even of companies that were building businesses that were, you know, around open source projects. So it can be an enabler. What are some of the common models? So dual license. This was very much a sort of an early, I would say maybe an earlier take on the idea that you could build a community and then have a commercial offering, a proprietary offering. MySQL was sort of perhaps the canonical example of this, where, yeah, sure, for free use for hobbyists, for a very small implementation, perhaps it's free. But then if you want to use it in an enterprise context, then you are taking on a proprietary license in effect. So it's distribution versus this enterprise offering. Open core, a similar model where you've got this question of okay, with open core, you do have an open source foundation, and then there are proprietary licensed pieces on top of that are sold as part of the offering. The advantage there is that everybody can get the benefit of the thing, but if you want, and usually it'll be something like security improvements or additional IAM, that sort of thing, those are the things that you will then pay for in this open core model. Service and support, this is classic, this is Red Hat. where the code is freely licensed, is open source, but the service and support model, and this is an area where trademark becomes particularly important, is what the company is paying for. And latterly, a tremendously successful way of making money and building a business model around open source technology is managed services and SaaS. When we look at any of the companies in this space that are doing well and see that alignment between what they're doing from a community perspective, what they're doing from an open source project perspective, and what they're doing from a commercial perspective, SaaS has proved a really good way of building a sustainable growth model in open source, which is not to say that investors won't always want you to move a little faster. So different license styles. We've got some examples here. Permissively licensed. And this is in many respects and for a long while, before a recent wave of relicensing, it seemed like the permissive license was beginning to dominate. So Apache, BSD, MIT, these have enabled a huge amount of innovation and indeed, in some cases, some proprietary advantages. So Apple is probably the best example on the planet of having built on a permissive license and made a huge amount of money based on that. But we have Apache, fantastic job in terms of one of the areas of real strength. Apache license projects would be in data projects. There are a number of big data projects, or lastly AI projects that we would know, again, Flink, Kafka, and so on. File-based, which is if you make a file change, you have to reciprocate. Finally, copyleft, AGPL, which really, it sort of was an attempt, I think, arguably, to do some of the things that some of these current vanity licenses are doing, where they felt that the GPL was not going to be funnily enough protective enough. Obviously GPL is a protective license, but the AGPL sort of trended a little bit, and arguably these days it's things like the business source license that have taken on that sort of role. So why open source? Why not open source? There are two answers to this. One big answer would just be open source was frankly the greatest software distribution and packaging mechanism the world had ever seen. The best way that you could touch the greatest numbers of users globally and excite them with your services, excite them with the software that you were building, this very low friction model was open source. So no doubt about it that the success of things like, Linux is just a fantastic example of that. But we could also look at it in database, Postgres, and so on. Open source is just a fantastic way to build a user base. Now, that's not necessarily a paying user base, of course. That is just people using the software. And definitely the most effective software distribution mechanism there had ever been, without a doubt. Until, indeed, the cloud came along and Amazon Web Services arguably became the new greatest software distribution mechanism the world had ever seen. Amazon has so many touch points with so many developers, with so many enterprises, and so on, that in effect it became an easier way, a new way of packaging software so that you could touch more customers. Now that brings some interesting implications that we'll talk about shortly, and arguably a lot of the relicensing trend today is frankly because shareholders and others feel that Amazon is, as they say, free riding on the work that they are doing and making the most money from the open source projects that they are contributing to and building. So why not open source? Yes, you have to do the work. There's a great deal of work that goes into building software, maintaining software. It can be a thankless task. This may be the case if you're a one-person maintainer of a project. And people are very happy to come along and start shouting at you on the internet that you are not providing the level of service and support that they would expect from the software they use. We live in an era of privilege, and people they expect rather a lot from people that have built software and given them so much value for free. So it can be a thankless task. And the question is, well, if it's all open source, why would I pay for it? So you've got two things. You've got the users shouting at you because they feel you haven't built the feature they wanted or whatever, but they are buggered if they're going to pay for it. Yeah, and also this question of investors and whether they are aligned with the needs of the project. Once you take money, open source may not be the right model for you. Yeah, pretty clearly, I've talked about SaaS as a way to monetize open source, but also, here's the thing. There are plenty of, as we move from a world where open source was the greatest software distribution mechanism of all time, if SaaS and Amazon Web Services, but SaaS now has taken on some of that mantle, maybe you never needed to open source in the first place. I think this is a question because we do talk to people that, oh, I'm just going to open source. And, why are you open sourcing is a good question. Perhaps it's because you do, just genuinely want to learn in the open. You want to teach in the open. You want to build in the open. You want people that are going to be helping to fix the bugs. You want to hopefully build a community. But that's not always the case. One thing we would advise, and we're going to talk a bit about this, is that if you do choose an open source license, then changing it does break a social compact. If you have built a community of users external to your organization, and then you go and make a fundamental change, then yeah, they're likely to be very upset about it, and that may have repercussions. It's up to you to decide whether that's a risk you want to take or whether that is a price that you want to pay. But yeah, changing a license from an open source license to a proprietary license, there are some issues with that. You're within your rights, but I think the question, and this is the question recently we've asked, what are the carrots and sticks that the users have? And one of them is they can stop using it. Perhaps they're using it so much they feel they can't do it. Open source can enable competitors. I think when Google open source Kubernetes, they did sort of initially, I think there was a grand hope. Yeah, amazing. We're gonna be the company that gets all the Kubernetes hosting. It's this portable layer, and people will be less reliant on AWS, and all of those workloads will come to Google. It didn't work out like that. That's not how open source works. The fact is, if you're doing open source, then others may indeed benefit. Not to say that Kubernetes has not benefited Google, but yeah, the fact is that it is a level playing field, and if someone on that level playing field has some advantages, they're likely to play them to great effect. And certainly from Amazon's perspective, that is a very, very successful business for them, Kubernetes. But for the industry at large, it is indeed a portable layer, and it has been very good in terms of that container market and user freedom. I think along with the thanklessness, it is true that open source, once you've got users, and if you want to build there, it may be free for some users, but it's certainly not free for you. Okay, so this report, and I think report might be overstating it from Amanda. That was very kind of you, Amanda. It's basically a piece of very useful work, really a blog post that my colleague Rachel Stevens wrote. When we asked ourselves, well, what happens when businesses change from these open source to proprietary licenses? As I said at the top of the call, these are discussions we've been involved in. We've had examples where people have changed their licenses and come to ask us for a quote to support that. And I said, well, you could have a quote, because it's one of the things we do as analysts. We'll provide our clients with quotes about what they're doing in the marketplace, so you can have a quote, but I don't think you'll like what we say. So what happens when these licenses are changed? Because I think there has been a view, certainly among investors, that absolutely, changing the license is just a great way to ensure that you make more money. There are some examples where they are absolutely determined. Oh no, this absolutely is the case. We would have gone out of business, or we absolutely had to change the license. But yeah, let's look at some examples in market: MongoDB, Elastic, HashiCorp, and Confluent, and see what happened when they relicensed. Okay, and here's the thing. So having data sets available is not always easy. Many of the companies in the commercial open source space, in fact, have not IPO'd. So it's not public data that we have, and you can't just rely on some random figures that a VC-funded company gives you. So having companies that we can actually understand their, for example, revenue change over time from publicly reported results, this was just, these were the 4 companies that we chose. Now, the dotted lines show us when the license change happened from an open source license to a more proprietary license, and something sort of shouts at us when we look at these data plots, which is it's really not very clear, is it? It's in no way obvious that there were disjunctions at the points at which the software was relicensed, when suddenly the business became much more successful from a revenue perspective. And we think that's interesting because, yeah, and there are very strong voices on both sides. There are those that would say, oh no, absolutely, open source is a nightmare, let's go closed source, we'll make more money that way. And there are others that will, and probably Redmonk is a bit more on the, well, you can do it, but you don't need to do it. It's a Rorschach test, this data, in that I think both sides saw this and said, oh yeah, that proves it. It's partly to do with confirmation bias being the sweetest of all biases. But anyway, what about other measures? Let's talk about market cap. The reason we have 2 here is that Mongo's market cap has changed enough that it would be hard to see, in fact, the Elastic, HashiCorp, and Confluent market cap changes over time. Again, it is in no way clear that changing the license is going to lead to a significant improvement in your market cap. I mean, MongoDB has executed extremely well. MongoDB did make this change. We don't know, actually, had they not made a license change, whether they would still be in the position that they're in. I think they have to feel pretty good about where they are. Very successful business. They moved into SaaS with their Atlas product very effectively. They've done a fantastic job of turning open source distribution into a paid business model. There is no doubt. Excellent execution, great sales force, and really a brilliant company, MongoDB, from that perspective. But when we look at this, yeah, there is no clear evidence, at least in this reasonably limited data set. Like, we're not claiming to have all the answers. This is just some interesting data points. It's by no means obvious that making this change is going to lead to a change in revenues or indeed in your share price. One last thing to note, we live in a world, and one reason everyone's talking about sort of issues and things that were zero interest rate phenomenon, money's a lot harder to come by, and it's important to note that none of these companies are profitable yet. So one of the things driving investors to say to companies, you must relicense, is they're hoping that by relicense, they will be able to get to profitability closer, because the VCs and investors don't want to put more money in. That's been one of the sort of macro trends of late, driving some of these desires by companies to change their licenses. But I think we've got an interesting example, because whilst the investor classes, I think, felt this was done, oh good, we don't need to worry about this commercial open source so much, we'll relicense, and that is the best way of proceeding. And they had seen some projects that we're doing okay. It was like, okay, Amazon looked at Elastic, created OpenSearch, was doing okay. We had seen forking not necessarily as a significant danger. Forking is hard, right? Of all the things I've said about getting the work done is hard. Certainly building in the open is hard. Building with competitors working on the same thing is hard. There are all sorts of coordination and collaboration problems involved in truly open source projects. Valkey was really interesting because Redis, when they, having said they would not, made a decision to relicense across the code base. There was a decision by a group to create a fork called Valkey. And I think one of the things that happened here that is very important is that Valkey was something that, again, Amazon jumped on very quickly, but Google as well. So if you've got Google Cloud and Amazon and a bunch of other third parties all saying that they are going to support and build around this fork called Valkey, suddenly the situation has changed. We began to see pull requests in Valkey that were accelerating, and Redis, Redis has a lot of very innovative technology coming down the pike. They feel they can monetize that. They feel this was a band-aid they wanted to rip off. But yeah, Valkey under the CNCF, under the Linux Foundation, very much looks like a project with legs. And I think that one of the things we've seen, we now internally at Redmonk, we talk about the hammer of Valkey, because we've had at least one conversation with an organization that was considering relicensing, and they looked at what had happened with Valkey. And honestly, I mean, the Valkey phenomenon is like, if you want to see the investments, and here's the thing from a, let's just say, if you want an extremely well-paid job in 2025, learn some C and get to know the Redis install base, because the money that these companies will throw at you will be substantial. These are strategic bets. This is not just, it's off to the side. Amazon is not joking. It is in an open source foundation, but it definitely has a huge amount of backing. And yeah, that's something that Redis will have to compete with. It feels it will, and that's, again, it's totally its rights to do that. These are business decisions after all, and we're all grown-ups. But yeah, so Valkey does feel different, and we have seen already at least one example of a licensing adjacent decision where they're like, you know what, after the Valkey thing, we really don't want to do this. So the idea that, I think, again, I've talked a lot about the sort of the investor classes, management classes, the idea that, oh no, there are no risks associated with forking, or there are no risks that a fork might become a business challenge. I think that now is open to question in a way that it wasn't at the start of the year. And yeah, as somebody that's argued about the strength and value of open source and sustainability of it over the years, I don't feel entirely bad about that. Yeah, and that's an interesting one. Open source foundations considered helpful. I think another one, and this was a different example. Flux was a project that a company called Weaveworks had built earlier in the year. Unfortunately, they went under as a going concern, and the Linux Foundation, or the CNCF this time, took the code. Oh, Amanda's saying any questions for James, so I guess I better shut up. I was about to finish, Amanda, but there you go. Yeah, so open source foundations play an increasingly important role in an era where software is being taken proprietary. Valkey is a good example. I was just mentioning Flux, where the community rallied round, so all of their users could feel comfortable using that. And yeah, I mean, if there is a danger that the code is going somewhere else, then yeah, absolutely. Foundations, which have been around, the Apache Software Foundation, Eclipse Foundation, and so on, for a long time in this industry, it turns out that they've had a bit of a new lease of life. And yes, indeed, I am I guess done in terms of my presentation today, and I'd love to know if anyone has any questions, and I'd be happy to answer them
It
to the
wasn't
best of my ability.
getting them lined up ready for you. I could feel you coming to the end. Super interesting topic, right? And it's something that we've all been talking about for a long time, which I think Valky has suddenly created this laser focus around, because as you said, James, forking is hard, right?
Mhm.
It's always been the nuclear option because it was so difficult. There were so few successful forks. Yet suddenly we've got a shift where you've got users forking, you've got customers forking, you've got massive money. And personally, I think this is one of the interesting pieces, is you've got massive money behind the forks, sometimes with a small company, technically in the wrong and receiving RR. And as you said, they're not profitable, many of the companies that are shifting license. Really difficult situation. And I probably come across as being very, very anti it. But actually, it's about logic and what fits within the open source model and what doesn't. I feel for those companies because it's a really difficult situation to be in. But it goes back to what you were saying in the beginning of your talk about business models, right? And maybe we could talk a little bit more about that and the decision to open source and what impact you think this is going to have on that.
Yeah, well, I mean, again, I don't know about. I mean, one of the things I think that's interesting, Amanda, is that a lot of this stuff felt like it. I mean, I feel for some of us that have been in open source for a long time, and I must admit, sort of looking at some of the people I know they're on the call with me, I know that some of them indeed qualify in that regard. I mean, it's sort of, we're relitigating stuff that we thought was done. So we just thought, you know, open source worked. We all understood that, and that was going to be good. So much so that a lot of younger developers, they didn't think about it. I was like, I don't, why, you know, why do I need to worry about open source? I coined the phrase, it's the POS era, the post open source era. People are just, oh, you know, it's on GitHub. That's open source, isn't it? Well, it isn't. But I think there was a consideration. So I think that yeah, what we're currently seeing is yes, relitigation of some things that we thought were done. And yeah, it does look like there's a little bit of life in the old dog yet.
So they've shifted the playing field, right? So the impact of Valky effectively allows a fight back potentially from open source to this shift away from the licensing model, because we were all outraged a few years ago when this started.
Mhm.
And then there's a gradual normalizing of people shifting away. And I'm being told by founders that VCs say, when are you going to shift, not if you're going to shift these days.
Yeah.
So will they still take that risk, do we think? Possibly not, right?
Well, I mean, you know, I think you're right that from an investor standpoint, it's a when. You know, when are we going to do this? So you know, that's it. Yeah, when that's the, you kind of have to pay attention to your investors, because especially as a VC funded business, you've got staff and everything else. You built, and I talked about the zero interest rate phenomenon, and yeah, so the founders are not always in charge of their own destinies there. Certainly once they've made some choices about taking a lot of money in. But yeah, I mean, there are still, there's some great companies that sort of, at the moment that look like, you know, arguably sort of true believers.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it's really great, or at least people that are. I think one interesting thing is companies that perhaps bootstrapping. There's a great Ukrainian observability company called Victoria Metrics. They're smashing it right now. They're very much open source, and you know that's not going to change. There's an Israeli guy called Eldad Fuchs that has a sort of back end as a service called AppWrite. They're crushing it. They're very much open source and will be open source. He is a true believer.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, you know, it's. I think what had happened was it's a bit like the, you know, the phrase about companies in general, built to flip, right? We build the thing with the idea that we're going to sell it. And so yeah, I think what had happened is that open source had become a, well, of course it's a tactic, you know. And once we built a certain amount of headway, then we will make a change. And I think that would have been a shame. And I think it was only really sort of being baked into an expectation fairly recently, Amanda. I mean, as you say, license changing, this is a debate that's been going on, well, probably since as long as open source, but certainly in the last 7 years or something.
Yeah.
But I feel like this, you're not wrong. The hammer of Valkey, for those of us that are a little bit righteous, is it's a useful one to have in your back pocket.
So I would say maybe 14 years ago, 12 years ago, I was advising startups and I was putting people off open source. And it was the experience I'd had in Canonical as we became super adopted, as Ubuntu became super adopted in the cloud space and didn't necessarily generate the revenue to match, right? And I used to say to people, what if someone takes your code and even this Gen 2 and the lack of understanding of open source, most of them would understand that might happen.
Yeah.
What if they take your code and they make money and you can see them start to squirm? What if they take your code and they make shitloads of money and you don't? And that's the bottom line, right? You enable your competition with your innovation if you do open source. It has this huge advantage where you can get adoption. I think Luis Villa said to me before lockdown, you won't find a startup in the Bay Area that's software based that isn't open source because of that adoption rate. But I think an awful lot of them hadn't understood the consequence. And that education piece, I suspect, will really move up the agenda now, because you can't search the words open source without getting this sort of stuff on open washing, on Valkey, on Fork right now. So it'll be really interesting to have this conversation again in 6 months, 9 months, a year, and see what impact it actually has. And it is only a few companies that are doing it, that are being forked. It's only a few companies that are doing the license shift, but they're really significant players, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is core infrastructure. I mean, if we look at Redis, I mean, Redis is used by literally hundreds of thousands of organizations, and I mean, on the developer side, millions and millions and millions of developers. Redis is, has been one of the most well used and well loved pieces of software in infrastructure ever, and so there was always going to be. But I mean, there were, one thing I didn't talk about is one thing of like single source as opposed to
I was
something. A piece of
product versus a multi-vendor product, right?
Exactly. If the community has really made those contributions, I think that was one of the things with, certainly some of the people behind the Valkey fork, they felt that they had made meaningful contributions in terms of taking Redis forward, and that if those contributions were then going to be made proprietary, that's why they were angry about it. Whereas I think one of the things about MongoDB is MongoDB never really made any pretensions that it was a community project. I mean, it was community adoption, but it was not something that people had outside had actually built. I think that's been one of the sort of the questions, and kind of an interesting one with like the OpenTofu project with Terraform, where HashiCorp had essentially done all the work. There were outside users and some contributions maybe, but it was not something that a lot of people had built. And I think that's one of the ones, we naturally get pretty upset when we've helped to build something and then we're told we can't benefit from the work that we've done. That's something that's really, really annoying.
Yeah. And I think that's it. And I don't think he's on the call today, but Stephen Wally, whose blog post we'll share, he has done quite a lot of analysis of historic forks and, which ones have been successful and which haven't, and where the contributions have come from. And I think that understanding the open source project itself and whether it really is a company project that happens to be open sourced with a single company behind it, or whether it has a community, I think that's a key factor and assessing the future of a particular open source. So I've been asking James questions because I did put in the chat, did anybody have any questions? There's lots of very knowledgeable people on here. I don't know whether they're intimidated by asking you, James, or whether
it's Friday afternoon. I mean, people, maybe they're just sort of...
You can have a beer.
They're looking forward to their weekend. I mean, have a beer and come back to me. But I think Dawn's presenting, and Dawn is much better and smarter than I am. So let's let's
Right.
get Dawn on.
On. Okay.
And,
So let's
and
James.
then you know, then maybe I'll ask Dawn a question.
Perfect. Okay.
But I might actually go and get a glass of wine in order to fully enjoy
You feel free.
the presentation.
I recommend it.
But if
Yeah.
anyone, you know, yeah, I didn't think I was going to be able to hang around. It looks probably like I can. So I want to see what Dawn's got to say. Dawn, if you could just ramble for about 90 seconds while I get this glass of wine, that would be amazing.
Go and get it.
But I'm going to get it. Thanks, everyone. If you have any questions, put them in the chat, or I'm at Monk Chips. Well, I was going to, yeah, just email me, james@redmonk.com. I'm happy to chat. Okay,
Thank you very much, James.
Okay, no worries.
Thanks. So I am now going to hand over to Dawn, who I think is going to drive her own slides, and Dawn is going to talk to us about license changes and forking. She doesn't really need much more introduction than she's had. A lot of the people on the call already know you well. Anybody who wants to ask questions, please don't be shy. If you put them in the chat, I can ask for you, or put your hand up and we can have you asking questions at the end. And then remember that this video will be shared afterwards. If you don't want to ask a question, you don't want to be on camera or anything, that's totally fine. Just put it in the chat. And let's hand over to Dawn and talk about forking. Thank you, Dawn.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I feel like James gave me the perfect setup for this talk. So I'll just get started. I did drop a link to the slides in the chat because the slides have loads of links to data, which you may or may not be interested in. Before I start, a super quick thank you to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation because they fund the Chaos Data Science Initiative, and also to the Linux Foundation and Ford Foundation who provide support for the Chaos project. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about me. I have been in this technology industry for well over 20 years, working mostly on open source. As Amanda mentioned, I'm on the board of OpenUK. I'm also co-chair of the CNCF Contributor Strategy Technical Advisory Group. And as part of the Chaos project, I spent a lot of time thinking about metrics and data for open source project health and sustainability. Now, projects owned or controlled by companies are more likely to experience things like forks or licensing changes that can impact the viability and usage of the project, which I'll talk about in more detail throughout the rest of the presentation. However, it's not just about ownership, it's also about control and looking at who's doing the development, which is why assessing organizational participation can be really important if you want to understand whether a project might experience a fork or what happens after a fork. And assessing organizational participation and other aspects of project health are something we spend quite a bit of time thinking about within the Chaos project. Open source projects that are controlled by companies have a higher risk of disruptions over the longer term because they operate at the whims of that company and their shareholders. And there's little recourse for outside contributors like us or users when that company decides to go in a direction that doesn't align with the expectations of the rest of us. For these company-originated open source projects, you can consider the reputation of that company as a steward of open source projects. However, you might think that a company is an excellent open source citizen and that their projects are unlikely to be relicensed and forked, like in the Redis example where they said that they would never relicense. So always keep in mind that companies can change direction with little or no notice. You never know when a company might be acquired by a company that isn't very open source friendly. So think back to Oracle acquiring Sun, for example. Companies can also change their strategy at some later date and make changes that result in a fork of their open source project. And lately, these companies have experienced a lot of pressure from VCs, shareholders, and other investors, like James talked about, to relicense their open source projects to generate more license revenue. And it's also possible that a company could just go out of business and abandon their open source projects entirely. Now, projects are much less likely to be forked if they're under neutral, well-run foundations, because those foundations encourage governance structures that create a level playing field where people from a whole bunch of different companies can work together as equals to create something that benefits everyone. Now, while it isn't very common, forks can and do still happen to projects under neutral foundations, usually when all or most of the development is coming from the employees at a single company. So one example of this was the CNCF project Cortex, which was forked by Grafana, the company driving most of the development on Cortex. And they were making a lot of changes that they wanted to open source, but they didn't want to open source those features under the Apache 2.0 license. So they forked Cortex and created Mimir as a company-owned project. It was still open source, but now under the GPL v3 instead of the Apache license. Now they pitched it as a strategic decision, but it was also effectively a relicense. And there are lots of things that can cause disruptions in open source projects that can result in a fork. But lately, the relicensing has been a big one. But the one thing that these have in common is that they're just a lot more likely to happen if the projects are tightly controlled or owned by a single company. And this is why thinking about organizational participation in open source projects is particularly important. Now, the CHAOSS project recently launched a series of practitioner guides designed to help people interpret the tsunami of data generated by these open source projects, with the goal of finding ways to improve the health of those projects. And one of these guides is focused on organizational participation in open source projects. And unfortunately, we just don't spend enough time thinking about how organizational participation impacts the sustainability of open source projects. Now, the CHAOSS project has several metrics that help understand it in open source projects, so I'm not going to go into detail on them here, but the practitioner guide has more details on each of those. But the biggest challenge with identifying trends for organizations and open source projects is that the organizational affiliation data is almost never accurate enough to actually use without doing a fair bit of manual cleanup. The example on the slide is relatively clean compared to some others, but you can still see that about 20% of the contributors aren't matched to organizations. And this data cleanup can be very time intensive, says someone who just spent a bunch of time doing it for several forks. And since it requires spending a bit of time on LinkedIn and searching online for people who don't have clear LinkedIn profiles to figure out where people work. And you can't possibly do this for everyone when you're looking at large open source projects. But you can usually do enough to get a reasonably good understanding, at least for the people making most of the contributions. And this can help you see if most of the work is being done by people at a single organization, which can help you understand the dynamics around the potential for a license change or other disruption that might result in a fork. It can also help you understand what happens in the case of a fork, which is what I'll focus on for the rest of the talk. And the practitioner guide linked on the slide also has a few more details about the topic and cleaning up the data. Now, if you've ever heard me talk before, you've probably heard me say something about how open source projects are complex and no two open source projects are exactly alike. Similarly, one trend you'll see throughout the rest of this presentation is that different types of open source projects experience different impacts on community and project health, depending on the situation surrounding the fork in the project. In particular, one thing you'll see across the examples on the next few slides is that it's important to consider the user impact separately from the impact on the contributor community. Depending on the nature of the fork and the type of project, the impact on the users and the contributors can sometimes be very different. Now, I'm not going to go into much detail on this slide, but you can find all of the data that I'm going to talk about today in the CHAOSS repo linked at the bottom of this slide. And we welcome feedback and contributions. So this is a project that we're running under CHAOSS, so you can contribute if you're interested. If you want to dig into the code and the data, it's all there for you to have a look at. And while the data is stored in GitHub using Jupyter Notebooks, you don't actually need any data science skills or, frankly, any programming skills at all to understand it. So the thing I love about Jupyter Notebooks is that you can, if you want, just ignore the code and just look at the text and the output, and you can get a pretty good idea of the results. Now, let me start by saying that there is no perfect data to understand the impact that employees of a particular organization has on an open source project. And I need to spend some time talking to these projects to better understand what we're seeing. So the goal of this research is not to have perfect data, but to get a feel for how employees of particular organizations participate in these projects. And I already talked about how hard it is to gather data about where people work. And I think I've come up with a reasonable solution to gather data about the most significant contributors. I was able to identify employers for most of the significant contributors, but there were also a few gaps. So if you're familiar with any of the projects that I'm going to talk about now, you can have a look at the notebooks and help me fill any of those gaps. I used numbers of commits as a starting point to only gather employer data from people who had made 10 or more commits for larger projects and 5 or more commits for smaller projects. But sometimes commits aren't a good indicator of the amount of work either. So most of the results actually look at the number of lines added and lines deleted to get a better feel for the magnitude of the contributions. I also only focused on the primary repository for each project, just to keep it simple. So I talked earlier about how organizational affiliation data is important when looking at relicensing and forks. So I started with that, but the plan is actually to look at a bunch of other project and community health metrics for these projects as well. So this, as I mentioned earlier, is an ongoing research project. Now let's talk about Elasticsearch and OpenSearch. Elastic moved Elasticsearch and Kibana under the server-side public license, dual licensed with an Elastic license, which are not OSI-approved open source licenses. So as of 2021, when they made this decision, Elasticsearch and Kibana were not open source projects when they were relicensed. And as you'll see on the next slide, almost all of the existing contributors to Elasticsearch were Elastic employees. So the relicense had very little impact on contributors since there were just very few outside contributors. But there was a pretty big impact on some users of Elasticsearch who had to decide whether they could use it under one of these licenses because, frankly, there was no good alternative. So this resulted in a decision at Amazon AWS to fork Elasticsearch into a new project called OpenSearch so that they could give their customers an alternative to Elasticsearch and Kibana. Now, without a strong open source contributor community, there wasn't a strong contributor base to drive the fork. So AWS was mostly starting from scratch with employees who were still learning about the code base. And frankly, it took them quite a while to get something out, and it was really hard work. And I'll be honest, I never thought that the OpenSearch fork would make it this far, because historically, most successful open source forks were driven by the contributors who worked on the original project. And I'm happy to be wrong about this, and I was absolutely delighted to see them announce that the project is moving under the Linux Foundation. And while it's still too early to tell, I do suspect that Elastic will be able to continue to deliver Elasticsearch to its customers, either under the SSPL, the paid Elastic license, or the AGPL, since it's a pretty established project with lots of users. However, I also think that OpenSearch will have a stronger contributor community and usage among those of us who care more about embracing open source solutions, especially now that they're moving OpenSearch under the Linux Foundation. Now, in this example, so now we start to look at the data. I'm comparing the year before Elasticsearch originally relicensed. So during this first period, the project was still under the Apache 2.0 license. So this is before they did the relicense. And then in the second period of time, on the other side of the slide, the project was under the SSPL and the Elastic license. So this is during the period when Elasticsearch was no longer an open source project. And you can see in the data that it made very little difference in this case because Elastic never built a strong contributor base outside of the people who worked at the company. And in both time periods, Elastic employees were making 95 to 97% of the additions and deletions to the code base. And I'll run this again in 6 months to see if adding the AGPL license makes any difference. But frankly, I'd be surprised if anything changes. Now, in this example for OpenSearch, I'm comparing the early days of the OpenSearch fork, so the first year right after they forked, with the most recent year, but with an end date of when OpenSearch was moved from Amazon into the Linux Foundation. So I did spend some time actually in the OpenSearch community shortly after the fork. And in that first year, a lot of work was being done within Amazon. While the code was public, a lot of the discussions and decisions were happening inside the company. So it's not surprising that we see here in the data that most of the contributions in that first year were coming from Amazon employees. Now, in the most recent year, you can see that this has gradually shifted to bring in more contributors outside of Amazon. And they've made improvements in their governance that's allowed more people to contribute, and that helped facilitate the move into the Linux Foundation, which, again, I think is a great step for OpenSearch. And it's worth noting that there's one individual from a company called Ivan who made a lot of the non-Amazon contributions in both of those time periods. But there were also significant contributions from others. So I feel like this is maybe trending in the right direction from my perspective. And I'm super interested in rerunning this analysis in 6 months after the project has been under the Linux Foundation for a bit. Now, Redis and Valky. So James mentioned this earlier. This is a very different example from the one I just talked about. In this case, there were a lot of contributors to Redis who weren't employed at Redis, partly because Redis had said that they would never relicense and it would always be an open source project. But when Redis moved to non-open source licenses, these contributors forked the project and started a new project called Valky. And this new project was started under the Linux Foundation. So from the start, it was under a neutral foundation, rather than being started by a single company, the way Amazon AWS started OpenSearch. And even though Valky is a relatively new project, you can already see how it's different from the previous example. So let's dive into this data. So starting with Redis. So Redis was relicensed less than a year ago, so we don't have as much data as we had with Elasticsearch and OpenSearch. And I admit the data looks pretty strange, frankly, but I can explain at least some of what we're seeing. So let's start with the year leading up to the relicense. So while Redis was still open source. Now, while the contributions were dominated by Redis employees, there were still about a dozen people who made significant contributions. And in the 6 months after the relicense, all of the external contributors from companies like Amazon, Alibaba, Tencent, Huawei, and Ericsson, who contributed over 5 commits in the year leading up to the relicense, mostly stopped contributing. You do see that some of them made 1 to 3 commits shortly after the relicense, which looked like it indicated work that was already in progress, that was just being merged after the relicense. Now, the bit that looks pretty odd is that the percentage of Redis employee contributions looks like it's gone down, but this is not a result of more contributions necessarily from outside of Redis. It actually has more to do with the fact that the contributions from employees, along with everyone else, have just gone way down. And you can see this in the raw numbers, where you'd expect to see about half as many additions and deletions for the 6-month period, but instead it's way lower than that, which indicates that there are just fewer changes happening in the Redis repository. And there are lots of reasons that might happen. But Redis, like many projects, has a big long tail of contributors who make only a small number of minor changes. And because there's so little overall activity in the repo, this long tail is making up for a higher percentage of changes than it was in the past. So I definitely need to talk to someone from Redis to better understand exactly why this is happening. But you can contrast this with Valky. So right now, this data is cut off when I originally ran it in August. I thought about updating it, but I actually want to wait until we have 6 months of data. So I'll rerun it again after next week. But even with less than 6 months of data, you can get a feel for the organizations that are contributing to Valky. You can see that Google employees have made most of the additions and deletions. And frankly, most of those changes came from one of those 2 people. Amazon, on the other hand, has a bunch of people who have made more commits. And there are pretty significant contributions coming from folks at Ericsson, Huawei, ByteDance, and a few others. And a lot of these individuals were contributing to Redis and then have now moved to the Valky fork. And with Valky as a Linux Foundation project from the beginning, it's not unusual to see contributions from a pretty diverse set of organizations. Now, again, this is a very different example from the previous ones for a couple of reasons. So like with Valky, This new project was started under the Linux Foundation. So from the start, it was under a neutral foundation rather than being started by a single company, the way Amazon AWS started OpenSearch. However, in other ways, it's a lot like the OpenSearch fork because it was driven by users who had never contributed to Terraform. So they had to start from scratch, similar to how the folks at AWS started OpenSearch. So let's have a look at this data. So similar to the Elasticsearch example, you can see that HashiCorp employees made almost all of the significant contributions to Terraform, even before the relicensing, with only 1 or 2 people outside of the company making significant contributions. So it's not surprising that the situation is about the same after they relicensed. OpenTofu, on the other hand, has a diverse set of contributors from a variety of companies, with Spacelift and ENBO, I'm not sure if that's how you say that, employees making the most significant contributions, and no contributions, surprise, surprise, from HashiCorp employees after the fork. However, it's interesting to note that none of these contributors contributed to Terraform before the fork. So like with the OpenSearch example, these were contributors who had to learn the code base and start from scratch. And this is in contrast to Valkey, where over a dozen contributors moved to the fork. There are also a few people who don't have a company affiliation or where I couldn't determine one. And there are a lot of people who've made small contributions, which is to be expected in kind of a new and exciting project. Now, before I wrap up, I'm going to leave you with just some resources you might find useful. The Chaos Project. We have tools, metrics models, lots of things for measuring all aspects of open source health and project viability. We are welcoming. Anyone's welcome to join us. We have loads of places where you can contribute without writing a single line of code. We also have a data science working group, shameless plug, where we talk about this ongoing research about relicensing and forks data. So this, as I said, is a chaos research project that is not just me, but other people are starting to get involved in it. And you can find our meeting calendar and links to our Slack workspace from these links. And I also wanted to briefly mention the newly released practitioner guides, which are designed to help people who aren't data experts make improvements in the open source projects that they care about. And we have guides on responsiveness, contributor sustainability, organizational participation, and security. So let me wrap this up by saying that building sustainable open source projects over the long term can be a challenge. It's hard work, and it takes time from the people who are maintaining these projects. And at the same time, as James talked about, companies are under increasing pressure from VCs, shareholders, other investors to deliver a strong return on their investments. And one way that companies are choosing to do this is by relicensing some of these popular open source projects in the hopes of generating more revenue. So as much as I would not like to see this, I do kind of expect to see more relicensing resulting in forks of open source projects over the next few years. I hope that the example that James talked about, that there are more of those who are maybe more reluctant to do it, given the success of forks like Valkey. And these discussions about forks and relicensing aren't just about interesting data or research navel gazing, as much as I like that. As organizations, or even as individuals, when you're thinking about which open source projects to embrace, I'd think hard about the organizational participation dynamic in those projects before committing your time and energy to projects that are dominated by a single organization. With that said, we can open it up to questions.
Thank you, Dawn. And that point is one that it fits, I think, almost into a bigger picture where we start to look and talk about choice in using open source and users, because the scale of adoption, which we're all familiar with, has not been matched with the scale of understanding. And that's a real part of the problem. And users actually need to be accountable in understanding what they're choosing to use if it is a significant part of their internal infrastructure. This piece, we've been talking about it for several years now, but I think this forking conversation gives people a reason to start to listen to that assessment of your, I like your hoodie, that assessment of your distracted ADHD kicks in.
I thought you'd like it, and the earrings.
Absolutely, completely there in the OpenUK team colors, unlike me. What it does is it actually gives a good reason to focus the minds on why you should be doing this assessment, right? What the risk is, because the risk becomes real and apparent. Hobie has put his video on. I don't know if that means he has a question for you. He hasn't put his hand up, but he's come on camera. So I'm hoping that means he's got a question. And James, I'm hoping he's probably on the second glass of wine by now, if we're honest. But James, I hope, will have a glass of wine in his hand or a beer or something and maybe want to add to the chat as well. But thank you, Don. I think that granularity that you are starting to build is something that, as it's shared wider, will really influence thinking around this. And, you know, I'm grateful to you for looking at what I've written so far, because there's a lot more depth that we'll get into and the whys and the hows of it as we get a detailed understanding. So, Toby, did you want to jump in with a question? Toby's question is, thank you for the meeting. I'm learning fast. This is the issue that worries me as I plan a product launch of a new remote control tractor. Interesting. In the next couple of years. I work in developing robotic tools and sensors in agri-tech. You should speak to Vicky Brasseur, who's just moved into agri-tech. One of the biggest challenges is supporting farmers with software embedded in the tools they use. And I don't know where you are, but I know in Australia, this is absolutely massive. Companies fear legal action if the machine they sold maybe some years ago with different onboard software.
Yeah, without reading the article, it's become a thing particularly in the US, which will happen here, that companies need to give farmers a right to repair the equipment they've purchased, although they continue to pay a software license. And a lot of the issues relate to software, which might have been developed years previously under a GPL license. The biggest challenge for the companies is the fear of being sued by something they have virtually no control over, maybe years down the line. And this is why they're very reluctant. John Deere is the one that's picked out in that particular piece, because they do have they're probably the biggest in the USA, and they have been quite, shall we say, awkward about access to repairing and charging farmers to repair their machines, which they could do with a set of spanners or a modem or a router, I should say. So there are some of the issues that I see. And the question I'm asking is this something of interest to OpenUK? Is it something we should be watching?
Any thoughts? It's quite specific. James, you're on mute. I'm really glad to say that back to you. I feel less stupid.
Amanda, well, I've had a glass of wine now, so I'm more relaxed. I mean, Amanda, you run OpenUK, so I think Toby asked a specific question. So when is OpenUK going to announce its agri-tech vertical, so you can ensure that farmers can keep their tractors and seeds open? This seems like an important issue.
You are taking the piss, but actually,
how dare you? I am not. You are. Dare you?
Well, okay, you're not. And actually, this question is very timely, because we have been launching a number of advisory boards with really high-profile individuals from academia, from enterprise, from engineering, coming together to look at different challenges and issues. And I mentioned Vicky Brasseur to Toby, and I have actually been talking to Vicky about how we could set up an agri-tech special advisory board to look at these issues, because we think it's one of the key areas. We're about to launch a space one, and we've been trying to identify key areas that we think are going to have a massive impact or be impacted massively by open source. And there's the usual things, like we know automotive is already pretty much there. We know that the telco sector is still kicking and screaming, but it's on its way. We see space. In June, I think, the Lord Mayor of London announced the Space Commons, which are being built in the Commonwealth. I'm trying to get further into that and to bring people who actually know about geospatial data into that conversation. And we have identified agri-tech as one of those. So it is something that's on the radar. It is something that's coming down the line. It's probably not the most imminent and urgent for us, but it is a topic. You talk about right to repair, and it's one of the things that open source ought to fix, right? So the access and availability to the code in perpetuity, so the code always being there, whether it's updated or not is another thing, but that actually should be one of the drivers towards open source in the software space. So, it's something that I would like to think, as people build better understanding the value of open source in creating longevity of product life, will come to the fore. And that should be something that matches into the Sustainable Development Goals and is actually seen as a significant economic advantage over time. Whether people will get that kind of detail and how easy that's going to be to explain is a whole different thing. Was that related to forking other than it's tractors and forks?
No comment on that.
Amanda, are you making a from farm to fork joke? Is that?
Damien is saying he would love to see Elasticsearch adopt OpenSearch. I'm quite happy to put a bet on that not happening in the distant future, if you're a betting man.
Yeah. If you met Shay, it seems pretty unlikely.
Well, I am trying to get Shay to come because he is coming to the UK at some point, and I am trying to get him to the State of OpenCon because I think we could have a fascinating conversation. We want to bring all sides of the conversation together, and that full circle that Elastic has done. I don't think anybody's talked about that today, seeing Elastic going back to open source. I mean, that is a fascinating shift in this landscape, right?
Yeah, I briefly mentioned it, but the choice of license is kind of interesting because it's the AGPL isn't a particularly corporate friendly license. So
I think the jury is out on that one. I mean, he declared victory. I think possibly. I mean, that was interesting.
Yeah, I don't think it'll change anything because the types of companies that are likely to just use Elasticsearch under the SSPL are probably the same people who would use it under the AGPL. I don't know that they're getting any more by putting it also under the AGPL. That's my personal opinion. I am also not a lawyer or a licensing expert.
I'm not a licensing expert, despite what everybody says to me. And one of the things that I noticed after Elastic and just the level of kickback, and I didn't just notice, I spoke to Raja Grafana about this, was they moved to AGPL. And obviously there is a trend with companies relicensing within open source to AGPL. And the whole thing is the point of distribution. So we used to rely on licenses that kicked in on distribution. And if you didn't distribute, the license requirements for things like copyleft didn't apply. And then once you start to do a platform environment or to put your code into the platform, you're not distributing the code by and large. And that's where the fundamental cloud problem came in, and all this discussion about do we need licenses fit for the cloud environment came from. And I guess AGPL is the only answer really within open source that we have to that, I think, unless anybody knows more than me on that one. So it's the default. So it is what you would use. Does it actually do anything helpful? Who knows?
Yeah, I just know that there are several very large tech companies who will not use any code under the AGPL. So for a lot of vendors, so I've worked at vendors, if you include AGPL code in your products, there are certain companies that will no longer buy your products, which is why the AGPL becomes problematic from a corporate perspective.
And, that is a really interesting point, because one of the things that we see is a shift. As you see adoption at the scale we've got, you see a shift in where your risk is managed from contracts and procurement people to the actual practical, how does that code get into your organization, engineering use of the code, and policies and procedures. And I think that historically you've always had a list in there of licenses that were a no-go. Most companies probably don't have these systems working the way they ought to yet, but GPL used to be the problem. And people didn't want GPL on their code base because they were worried about viral effect. And I guess that we're just seeing the same knock-on effect now with the forking and the license changes. So I'm conscious it's Friday afternoon. James, was there anything, having heard Dawn, that you wanted to revisit from your talk today?
No, not really. I just thought it added a lot to what I'd said. We sort of provided some reasonably high level context. I think Dawn provided some really useful data about that. It's one thing for me to be like, oh yeah, waving my hands about it depends on how many outside contributors there are, and so to get that data over time correlated with some information about license changes, I just thought was extremely valuable. Something for me to take back to Rachel and say, here, you should watch this short presentation by Dawn. I think it's relevant. So yeah, no, I think that would be the main thing that I drilled in on. I think the Chaos Project is interesting and useful. It's great to see the work that Dawn does. And she did nothing in that presentation to disavow me of my very positive introduction of her.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I don't have to say thank you to Don now because you have. I should say thank you to you, James. You delivered an insightful topic, an insightful presentation to the topic to help set Don up for that granular detail. And I think bringing that economic aspect to the conversation is critical, right? Because it's always money that's going to get attention, whether we like that or not. That's what talks. And when you look at what happens with the VCs, when you look at what happens with companies lifting and shifting or license changing, it's all driven by money. It's all driven by shareholder value. So understanding how that data actually then impacts revenues on companies. And we've seen many people writing about how great their company has been after their license shift and how it hasn't impacted them adversely at all. But being able to counter argue that it looks like it's not actually doing anything positive either and must have cost you reputationally is a nice piece to bring to the conversation. So thank you for bringing that to us today. Had we had a bit more time, I would have discussed a little bit more on what we're doing, but we are bringing together a report, which we will hopefully have done in the next couple of weeks, on shaping of markets. And what we're looking at is how a market shaped beyond legislation with things like standards and skills and the things that impact the environment. Could be procurement terms, could be procurement requirements. So we have a bunch of different stuff, and the report will be a relatively high level because we're looking at many different areas. But what we're hoping is that that starts to open up further conversations like this one across different pieces of the ecosystem and Jigsaw. So we will have that report in the next few weeks, and we'll share it with everybody who's been along today. And then also we will be hosting an event on the 11th of October and then the 13th of December for the next show and tell. So I very much hope that we'll see you at that. There you go. I've messed up my slides. I very much hope we will see you at that and that you join us again for the next show and tell. And we're going to focus on AI and skills in that one in December. Contact details for me are in there, for OpenUK are in there. And we will also share Don and James's and all of the different links that have been shared in this useful conversation with the video and on the show and tell page of the website. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us. You get 4 minutes back. I was hoping you would have got more back, but you get 4 minutes back on your Friday afternoon. I think it's been a really insightful and useful discussion. So thanks again to our speakers and see you all soon.
And thank you, Amanda, for pulling this together.
Well, thanks, Amanda.
Thank you.